So in this podcast episode, we get into the Day of the Lord and what it means not only for the Israelites, but what it means for us and what the prophets were trying to say with the Day of the Lord. With that said, let's get into it. There's a group of Christians, they're having this quote-unquote prophecy conference where they think that this corona situation is what's mentioned in Revelation, and this is a whole apocalyptic deal.
Yeah, I've heard like people referencing verses on how when it was talking about the Pharaoh and stuff like that. I need to find the verse. Do you remember the verse at all? It was when
You want like the plagues of Egypt you talking
yeah,
about?
people actually use those verses and relate it to what's happening now, and they use things like with the crickets or whatever they are, the crop dust and things. And then now with this plague and a few other mishaps that's around the world, like the Australian fires and stuff like that.
Oh, yeah.
I've heard that probably like 2 or 3 times from people that I know personally, and then I see it all over. I used to see it all over social media.
Yeah, actually, a lot of people, like in the past, like before, like, for 2,000 years, ever since, Revelation was written, there have been people doing that. And look at where we're at, I just... That there's a long line of people who hold that view of Revelation when they're and like you said, Genesis and Exodus, of like those kind of plagues. There's people who hold the view that like it relates to now. Hold that. There's a lot of people who say like, oh yeah, this is an example.
Yeah, for sure. How would you personally combat that when it comes to people saying, oh, what do you think about this verse and how it relates to what's happening now?
How would I combat that?
Yeah.
Well, first, so the main thing is that right now is what they're talking about. So I'll get specific and then I can combat it. The thing that you'll often hear with this Corona thing, this whole Corona situation, would be like, look at the 7 trumpets. You got your 7 bowls and your 7
Seals.
seals. That's right. And they'd be like, okay, there's the plagues, like what skin plague that's mentioned in there. So they'd be like, oh, look at this, told you, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
To combat that kind of idea, you'd kind of have to get into the more of when those things are supposed to take place. Also, they believe, those people hold the view that those plagues are in like sequential order, right? So like one after the other. And so I personally don't hold to that view, because the 7 seals and the 7 trumpets and 7 bowls, the 7 trumpets come out of the 7 seals and the 7 bowls come out of the 7 trumpets, right? They're like nesting dolls.
Yeah.
And so it seems more logical to think that they're describing the same thing just 3 times over in different perspectives, right? And so when they say this is literally happening and this is what's going to happen next, they're approaching the text with something they already believe that I don't think is right. And so I can't just be like, I can't just sign on to that. We have to address like their fundamental, like the base level stuff,
Yeah, I completely understand that.
I guess we could talk more about like the way language is used, since we're already kind of there with that kind of thing, people's view on language.
Yeah, we can talk about the misconception of language. I run into that a few times.
Well, not just the misconception of language. I was talking about like, well, yeah, actually kind of misconception of language, but like, the people who write this apocalyptic literature talking like weird.
Oh, like
weird
themes,
language,
symbols type.
and then we can get those wrong,
Yeah.
that kind of thing. That could be kind of. You want to do that?
Yeah, we can do that.
Okay, so I think whenever you get the weird language, like the really weird stuff, I found, especially in the prophets, you get it a lot with the Day of the Lord, and we kind of defined that. How it's the fulfillment of God's promises, both justice and mercy. It's the good and the bad. And we also went over how apocalypse doesn't mean just the destruction of everything. That's not at all what the biblical term means. It just means the revealing, just like how Paul had an apocalypse when he was on his way to Damascus. We went over that. So when we're going to Day of the Lord, we already kind of know what it means. And that's actually where we get a lot of the weird um, language that we're talking about here. This is where all the misconceptions start springing up, is when we start talking, describing the day of the Lord, right?
Mm.
So, like, simple example. This is one that's actually used quite a bit. Isaiah 13, first 11 verses. Just a quick paraphrase. He's just saying, like, look, on the day of the Lord, there's going to be people are going to be in pain. Every man's heart's going to melt. It comes cruel, burning like anger. The day is going to be destruction. There's going to be a flash of light. The sun's going to be darkened. The moon will not shed its light. So, like, when they hear the sun's going to be darkened, they're like, oh, it's an eclipse. And so when they see an
Yeah.
eclipse, they're like, oh, look, um, when that's not what the Bible's trying to, it's not trying to give you that security camera footage, like we often say. So how would you approach that, Luke? How would you kind of?
I would say it's hard for me because when you read stuff like this, it looks very literal. But through other texts in scripture that talks about like apocalyptic literature, and you refer that and what that is meaning to what this is meaning, you can use like keywords that are defined as symbols, and then you can compare them to what this is saying. And so you can make a reference and just in a not an opinion, but a distinct view of what this is saying and how this is actually more symbolism and theme type based than it is
So
literal sense.
where would you go, like when he mentions the sun darkening, where would you go if you wanted to look for the definition of this?
I would look definitely in Isaiah and most of the prophet books because they mainly talk about Day of the Lord type talk. I know they talk about it in Genesis also. Daniel for sure. I don't think they talk about it in Exodus, do they?
So
I'm pretty sure they
most of the
don't.
language. So this is actually the first time Isaiah mentions the day of the Lord that I just read. This is the first
Okay.
time. Um, most of the prophets get their language, especially for the day of the Lord, from the Torah, so the first five books of the Bible.
Hmm.
So personally, I would go there first because that's where they get their metaphors. So when they say the sun's darkening, it and if you go on and you read it from that point, so this is like about around verse 8-ish kind of. Isaiah mentions wail, the day of the Lord is near. It will come to destruction from the Almighty. The sun will be dark when it rises, and the moon will not shed its light. Um, that's like if you go to your Genesis, right? In the first 6 days, you got the sun is created, the ruler of the day, and then the moon is created, the ruler of the night, and the whole reason why God creates them is that they might shed their light on the earth, right? And now
Hmm.
that's not happening anymore. It's a reverse creation now.
Yeah.
That's so it's when we're getting those misconceptions about not just like apocalyptic literature and prophets, but like everywhere in the Bible, when we're getting misconceptions, even what Jesus says, when we're getting those misconceptions, it's often because we don't let the Bible define its terms, and most of its terms it gets from Genesis, though not all. Like Isaiah, and most of the prophets talk about the coming kingdom, when the kingdom isn't mentioned as much in the Torah at all. Um, that's kind of like a metaphor they kind of started to bring forth in their writing.
Yeah. Okay.
So I think the coolest one I found for the reverse creation is this one in Joel 2. It's actually it's the end, and the title heading for this one is literally called "The Day of the Lord." So you know what to expect. And it's a little, you're gonna have to think back. You mentioned Exodus and you quite like Exodus, so I'm assuming you're gonna kind of catch some of the stuff here. Joel actually uses a lot of Exodus for this part, so try to catch the repeating themes, rather than just assuming it's just straight literal and gonna happen. So
Go for it.
it's Joel to starting in verse 30 and ending verse 32. It reads, "I will display wonders in the sky and on the earth, blood, fire, and columns of smoke. The sun will be turned into darkness and the moon into blood before the great and awesome day of the Lord comes. And it will come about that whoever calls on the name of the Lord will be delivered. For on Mount Zion and on Jerusalem there will be those who escape, as the Lord has said, even among the survivors whom the Lord calls. Did you catch some of the Genesis and Exodus images there?
I didn't.
Not one. So like,
Can you read it one more time? Like, just cut out this part. Just read it one more time because I didn't really catch any of it.
it reads, "I will display wonders in the sky and on earth, blood, fire, and columns of smoke. The sun will be turned into darkness and the moon into blood before the great and awesome day of the Lord comes. And it will come about that whoever calls on the name of the Lord will be delivered, for on Mount Zion and in Jerusalem there will be those who escape, as the Lord has said, even among the survivors whom the Lord calls."
Okay, yeah. I see what it says. I display wonders in the sky and the earth, blood, fire, and columns of smoke. So it's talking again about like bad things are happening, sky is darkening, things are getting bad. Then it says the sun will be turned into darkness and the moon into blood. So I see that as a repetition of what we read earlier in Isaiah.
So like this is obviously a bad thing.
Yeah, I mean,
No dir, right? No sun. That's actually terrible for human life, right?
darn it.
Um,
Just kidding.
the what's actually interesting is that, so like in if he's mentioning Exodus images, and the way I know that is, where do you hear something turning into blood? The first time that's mentioned, that's in Exodus. Where do you see columns of smoke? That's in Exodus with the sacrifices, right? And the fire.
Oh
That's
yeah.
mentioned also there too.
Yep.
It's fire and columns of smoke, right? So fire is also a sacrifice image. Um, and then it's talking about blotting out the sun, so making everything dark. So these are obviously plagues of Egypt, right? We've seen these before.
Yeah.
Now, if you think back to the common Egypt story, or the movie that works too, Prince of Egypt, same thing. um, you see that these things are bad, but not bad for God's people, right?
Yeah.
So we already talked about, how the apocalypse is bad for Babylon, basically bad for the people who reject God, but good for God's people. Now this verse, you'll notice a lot with the prophets, whenever they mention a previous theme, whenever, not even just in the prophets, whenever a book in the Bible mentions a theme previously mentioned, it not only like makes you want to think about that theme, but also tries to advance the narrative. And Joel's doing that here. So like when he's mentioned these plagues of Egypt, you notice how the Joel thing, this is actually kind of interesting. Joel, when he's mentioning the plagues of Egypt, kind of paralleling it, you notice right after he talks about saving people, as if these quote unquote bad things are actually how God saves his people.
Yeah.
And if you notice, it's the same thing in the Jesus story.
Those parallels, though.
I know.
Awesome.
Remember what happens when he's dead? The sky turns dark, and
Yep.
then you start getting, yep. So this verse is also mentioning that. In fact, you'll notice at the end, the last verse says, "For on Mount Zion and Jerusalem there will be those who escape, as the Lord has said, even among the survivors whom the Lord calls." And before that, I just mentioned, and whoever calls upon the name of the Lord will be delivered, right? So
Right.
this is obviously mentioning to a time in which these things are going to save people, right? So this is, I would say,
Some good.
this is an apocalypse of Jesus, you could say.
Yeah.
It's a revealing of Jesus, just a bit. And Jesus is revealed to be the day Jesus died. The whole Jesus event from this prophet and other prophets, and how they describe this sort of thing. Jesus's event is the day of the Lord. It's a day of the Lord.
Okay.
But it's an odd one. It's just like all day of the Lords are. So like when we mention the day of the Lord, there's not just one, which you might think of.
Yeah.
Right? There's a lot. And so the day of the Lord is basically when justice is had. And that's what they're trying to do with this grand imagery, this big, like when they're talking about the universe and the cosmos and all the stars and everything. They're trying to show that, look, they mention specific places like, okay, you're gonna, you know, you have to repent. This is you're gonna God's gonna destroy this. But then to describe the destruction, they use big imagery, right? And the reason for that is because they're trying to address the current situation, both theirs and ours, while also trying to show how that fits into the massive scale of when God will finally fulfill all the justice.
Do you think that they use some imagery to drive a point even further, like use imagery as emphasis?
Like, give an example.
Um, all right. I will display wonders in the sky and the earth, blood, fire, and columns of smoke. That sounds horrific. Then the sun will be turned into darkness, so basically the apocalypse, and the moon into blood. So the moon won't literally be existing. Obviously, that's symbolism, but symbolism is supposed to be taken um, on how it is. So when you compare like an apple to something terrifying, right?
Mm.
Then you would be displaying how awful this apple is, like explaining how the symbolism to like say an apple and how terrible it is, like saying it's rotting like a dog's carcass, say for example.
Okay.
Um, do you think that that could put emphasis on how terrible the apple is?
So in English, that's how you'd use emphasis, but when you'd emphasize something in Hebrew, it's different. When they
Mm,
mention these big imagery, it's for a reason, less of an emphasis.
okay.
Um, but when they do emphasize things, it's not like they don't. Like we use exclamation points, they repeat words twice over.
So like beautiful, beautiful, or donkey, donkey, or
Yeah, they make something like they say it twice. It sounds weird in English, but it's how they say something.
or language and culture. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a bit different. That's the problem with reading not just this
If only we knew
revealing
Hebrew.
this. Yeah, if only the original Hebrew specifically, because though we can piece together some stuff, there are still quite a bit of debates on what certain words mean. Nothing
Yeah.
huge, but just like minor things here and there.
Yeah. Doctrinal things.
But that's that's sort of the overlay of kind of the how in apocalyptic literature and specifically in the Day of the Lord, how this cosmic grand big imagery and why it's used, right?
Yeah.
That's the general thing. What do you want to get into next about the Day of the Lord? Because we're trying to focus around the Day of the Lord, and we just looked about its descriptions and we looked at how people come about with misconceptions, right?
There's something in here called burdens on for point A. Did we ever talk about that?
Oh, so this is a part of so yeah, it's the verse I mentioned earlier. It's the Isaiah 13 verses 1 to 11, right? It's the first verse. So when it talks about when Isaiah was describing the day of the Lord, with when we first introduced this idea of the misconceptions with this cosmic imagery stuff, the the first time, the first part of the verse, you know, it's usually like the vision to Isaiah or this or that, the vision to the dream to whoever, right? This is starting in Isaiah. This is talking about the oracle concerning Babylon. This is the first verse. The oracle concerning Babylon, which Isaiah the son of Amos saw. Now, the word oracle, it's not an everyday word that you use in your average vocabulary, right? It's actually the word burden. It's used in the same context. So the way we know this would be if you go to Exodus 23, verse 5. It's very obvious that it means burden. So I'll point it out when the verse hits it. It reads, "If you see the donkey of one who hates you lying helpless under its load, burden, same thing, right? Under a heavy, carrying a heavy object, you shall refrain from leaving it to him. You shall surely release it with him." So this in Isaiah, basically what's happening is the quote unquote prophecy that Isaiah is having about the day of the Lord is a burden.
Mm.
Having the day of the Lord, which is basically just a revealing, an apocalypse of how God sees things,
Yeah.
that's a burden.
Yeah.
And you see that even more if you go to Jeremiah 20, verse 7 through 9. I think we've already addressed this, but in it, Jeremiah is wailing to God, saying like, "You've deceived me. You know, I thought this was going to be good," like his prophecy job, basically, right? Because God chose him to be a prophet,
Yeah.
and
That's
then it didn't turn out
difficult.
that way. And then people actually rejected him, and he was mocked by everyone. And he mentions how he describes a flame in his like soul,
Hmm.
basically, and
Yeah.
how it'll consume him if he doesn't get it out, you know. So it's a burden, revealing the day of the Lord, apocalypse. What would be the verb of an apocalypse? Apocalypsing the day of the Lord, revealing the day of the Lord to people, revealing how God sees things to people is a
Yeah.
hard thing. It's not easy. Because you know, though these prophets are, you know, amazing people, the day of the Lord is a hard thing for everyone. Like, even though God's people do get redeemed, they're redeemed through some hard things, right? Just like the Exodus
Hmm.
story, Joel mentions that as we looked at, the day of the Lord is not an easy thing.
Yeah.
So, do you want to talk about
Oh,
how the prophets revealed the day of the Lord? Because it
there's
wasn't
symbolism
just, well, yes, through symbolism,
and
but
themes.
it wasn't just through saying it, like announcing it with speech and writing it down.
Was it through their actions or something like that?
It gets really weird. You want to talk about it?
Yeah. I mean, yeah.
Let's get into it then. So we were talking about, you know, the how the prophets do talk about the day of the Lord, you know.
Hmm. Yeah.
So that they didn't just, you know, use nice public speaking or whatever. They were the prophets were mostly like people who lived on the edge kind of a thing. They were outcasts and they would do these weird public stunts to get their message across.
Yeah.
Which had a lot of symbols in them and also communicated something that was fairly straightforward. So, for example, Ezekiel, he goes in the middle of the streets on the dirt and makes a model of Israel and of Babylon and shows how Babylon's going to destroy Egypt with a toy model. Um,
Wow.
that's how he prophesies or communicates the day of the Lord. Now, Isaiah does it in a different way that's probably stranger. Isaiah walks around naked for 3 years trying to show how bad Israel is, how uncovered they are by their sin.
Wow. Imagine God wanted to make an example, right? So he used you and he said, "Yo, I want to make you naked for 3 years and I just want you to walk the streets."
Yeah,
And back then in the culture, they viewed as like being uncovered as not just like
it's bad. Yeah, it's
wrong, but it's like worse than it is now. It was like unclean because there were so many like diseases and stuff, and where if you weren't like fully clothed, um, you could be filled with like disease and stuff. You know, it's one
yeah,
big.
it's pretty bad.
So I'm
There
guessing it was
are
a really big symbolism back then, also.
there's
You
that.
say?
Also, there's some people who say he wasn't like naked, like wasn't like completely naked. Instead, he just took off his outer garment. I don't.
Well, then what would be the point of that?
Well, people usually had like an undergarment, something to like wear, and then they put actually the real garment on.
Oh, so you're saying that they were wearing like underwear? He was wearing underwear for 3 years.
Well, not just underwear. It was a bit more covered than that, but yeah.
Oh, that's
I
not.
don't. I don't know which.
Doesn't
There are
sound right
smarter
to me.
people that talk about that, but yeah. So
Yeah.
either way, it was huge for Israel, right? Because you're not supposed to just
Yeah.
uncover yourself. Um,
Yep.
Despite their warnings and these symbolic acts of the day of the Lord, guess what Israel did?
What they do?
Didn't
They
care.
didn't care.
Didn't
Yep.
care one bit. They
Jinx.
didn't. They did not care about what the prophets had to say. They didn't care about this day of the Lord that's going to happen, where God acts in human history to bring about justice. They didn't care about these warnings. They
Hmm.
revile them,
I wonder what happened.
and then you get Babylon, literally Ezekiel modeled with toys. So I mean, it's not
Well,
exactly.
when we're talking about Joel and how they still rejected him, what happened to um, Israel? They rejected God regardless, right? They
Yes.
didn't head the warning. What happened?
And then
With
you had a
historical
day of the Lord.
context,
You had the
they
day.
literally had a Day of the Lord event. Not that like they had an apocalypse, but
No, they
a lot
did.
of
Well,
a
an
lot of
apocalypse
well
is just
they
revealing.
did, but like not. It's so hard to explain it, man. With the and the and the it and the will, and it
Yeah, so
happened.
like an apocalypse is basically like what the prophets had when their God's thing was apocalypsed to them, revealed to them, right? They
Mm,
had a day of the Lord, which is what we think of as apocalypse. A day
right.
of the Lord's more of that. So like they
Yeah.
had
So
a
they
day, they literally had a day of the Lord, like you're saying.
yeah with the miscarriage and all that stuff. If anybody knows Joel, the story of Joel and stuff.
Yeah. Um, that yeah, the day of the Lord is not a good thing. So the day of the
What
Lord, what does it kind of speak? What's up?
I was gonna ask what happened with Isaiah. Like, how did he express that? Do you remember?
How did he express what?
Day of the Lord without words.
Oh, without words. So he did the naked thing to show how Israel would be.
Oh my gosh.
It is naked, right? And then he also he would he would write a lot actually. Him and Jeremiah. Isaiah spoke more to the people, while Jeremiah was more because the prophets. There's writing about the prophets, and there's writing from the prophets themselves. Um, it seems to be that Isaiah wrote the most about what his apocalypse was, about him seeing how God sees, and so he'd write to the people a lot. So he actually wrote a lot of prophecy and um, the prophecy back then, like the thing that's in your Bible, um, was actually more of a resistance literature
Yeah.
kind of a thing. Kind of like if there was if you lived in a government where you didn't like it and you were like writing against them, it'd be like that.
Mm,
That's kind of what they did. And they would talk about the day of the Lord because they're like, look, you guys have rejected God. Um, and apocalypses came to me basically that you guys are gonna, if you guys don't turn around, you're gonna have a day of the Lord. And and then they start describing cosmic imagery, like we said, and Isaiah wrote a lot of that resistance literature, like a lot, a lot. That's why he's actually one of the hardest to read because he was a literary genius. Um, yeah, Isaiah was an interesting fella, for sure.
yeah. So I have a question for you, Owen. My
Okay.
question to you is, since all this stuff is going on with the coronavirus and the fires and these murder hornets and all these different things that are just crazy that's going on out of nowhere, what can you say about how we can look at the day of the Lord and either reference it or do the opposite and deny that the comparison between them?
Obviously, I would say if a prophet was here today, they would probably say something similar to be like, it seems to parallel the same idea, right? That it's almost like plagues of Egypt, right?
Right.
Now, what the day of the Lord is it's God acting in human history to fulfill his promises. Justice, mercy, those kinds of promises, right?
Right.
We talked about that. Now, if you look in history, everyone agrees that the exile to Babylon happened. No one disagrees on that. The
Right.
disagreement is whether God did it or not,
Mm-hmm.
right? Whether God was behind it. God talks about him actually raising up Babylon for it to happen, while secular historians just say that's just the natural course of history. Um, the same thing could probably be said for today. So when something bad would happen, you could say, okay, whatever,
Yeah.
but you could say, perhaps this is God acting in human history. Despite whichever one you hold, it shouldn't matter too much because the end result is the same. The end result is to make sure, like the prophet said, you're you're not forsaking God like Babylon and these other nations, right? And that you're rendering your hearts to him. so that the day of the Lord is the quote unquote good version, right?
Yeah. That's the main reason why they even talk about. That is the only reason why they talk about these things. To go, hey,
It,
this is coming, and you need to be
yeah,
right with
to
God.
challenge and to encourage, right? Those two purposes. And so either way you take, the main message is the same, that you need to make sure that you are, I would say, right with God, unlike the Israelites when they were exiled to Babylon, in order that the day of the Lord is not a bad thing for you.
Right. Right.
Yeah, that's the general outline of the day of the Lord. We already went into it mostly previously, but so this was a good, just bringing it all together, into one thing. So let's finish off with our tune in next time thing. You ready?
Yeah.
3, 2,
Tune
1.
in next time.
Tune in next time. Wow, that was so bad.
Your kingdom come, your will be done. Let your kingdom come, your will be done.